Hey everyone, and welcome back. When last we were together, we were talking about what the perfect warm-up is, and then the logical next step to that is what would be the perfect cooldown for you or who you're training after a good training session. A lot of questions here, probably not quite as much as the warm-up. I think the idea being it's the workout is done, but I don't think it's any less important to kind of pay as close attention to your cooldown as well as your warm-up. The reason being is you're sort of in a more weakened state. More things can kind of go wrong right after a hard training session than right before. So this is something that you definitely do not want to neglect as you're kind of putting things together. So the idea here is your overall, we'll call it more post-worked activity, because cool down has a very specific meaning, but more what are the things that we should be doing afterwards in order to set up success for your next training session. This is our 2018 boys team. This was actually as they were getting ready for their track season that year. This was during a warm-up session. But some of the same things you'd want to worry about in terms of your warm-up and cool-down. So there are some similarities because the idea is, how do you get yourself ready for something immediately in the warm-up, or how do you get yourself ready for the next training session is what we're dealing with in the cool-down. So this was just one day we went north of Tampa. It was in December. It was a very cold day, so they had the extra layers and everything. So let's go ahead and get ourselves right into it. I'm Kyle Giacono. I'm the head boys cross country and track coach at Wharton High School in Tampa, Florida, and I have been for the last 7 years. If you'd like a closer look at some of my credentials, they are on the screen. All right, so what you really want to kind of think about is what did this workout do for you in a couple different aspects before figuring out what the right cool down is. Once we kind of go through this, we'll go through some different workout types, and then I'll kind of give you guys some suggestions that has worked for us in our situation. You can take some of that, all that, none of that, just use the principles to make your own. Certainly no silver bullet magic spell of doing this. There's not one right way. There's the right way for you in your situation. So you have to ask yourself what did this workout do for you in a couple different ways, which is what energy systems were stressed. That's important to look at. Was it an aerobic day, an anaerobic glycolytic day, an anaerobic alactic, or what we've called sometimes strength days, or was there a combination of different areas being stretched, which is more likely, but what was actually worked on in that day? What was the main area of fatigue? That's really important. Not just the energy system, but in what areas were you being fatigued? What was causing you to eventually need to stop the training? Central nervous system, was it a store of some kind of fuel? You're not able to fuel the working muscles. Was the fuel exhausted? Was acid accumulating? Was that the reason you had to stop? Or was there some sort of muscle trauma going on? Muscle, and I should have put tendon trauma on there too. Was it that? Was it more of a strength issue where the muscles are getting fatigued with some trauma going on there that caused you to stop? Or was it a mental fatiguing day? Any of those things could lead to some of the fatigue. And I also kind of want to look at generally, does this increase central nervous system activity post-workout, or is it decreasing it post-workout? And there's really a clear line there, and that's sort of where I draw my conclusions of where my cooldown are. Am I leaving this workout in a state where my central nervous system is really fatigued and more decreased, or is it kind of more charged up? And how do I make it come back down to baseline? The idea of bringing homeostasis back down to baseline. Do I want to get my central nervous system back up a little bit because it's been decreased, or do I want to bring it down and bring everything else, not just the central nervous system, but that's part of it, down to homeostasis along with your heart rate and your breathing and all those different things? That's sort of a general way of looking at it too. So different things you can ask yourself as you're looking at what the workout did for you or who you're training. All right, so we have some generalities here, just like we did with the warm-up video. The rule of thumb has been cooldown run of about half race distance. You kind of hear that thrown around, as well as static stretching afterwards in the cooldown session, okay? And this comes from, not really 100% sure where this comes from. In our warm-up video, I gave you guys two studies that really sort of played out why the opposite was the case in the warm-up. It really kind of touted more dynamic type activities in the warm-up, and I said that may not even be 100% true for aerobic work, but less study had been done in this, okay? It's a little bit more anecdotal accounts mostly on this. You hear from this coach that they did it, or maybe yourself, you kind of felt that it worked for you, but it really hasn't been generally studied in a large scale. There is a little bit from this study, and this was also in the video where we talked about warm-up. produced in 2016, where it looked at a bunch of different studies essentially and kind of gathered and reviewed a lot of the data. This is the name of the actual study itself if you want to look it up yourself. And it did find that post-exercise static stretching had no influence on injury or muscle recovery. They could not find any link between those things. And that's usually the reason why people say we're doing this cool down or stretching, whatever. I don't want you to be injured the next day, or reduce muscle, or increase muscle recovery or something like that. They couldn't find any real link to that. Now, maybe it was the way the studies were done. Maybe there's a better way of doing this in the future that will come to prove this out. But when this study looked at it, they found no influence, no correlation. There was nothing statistically significant that said stretching or something afterwards led to a reduction in injury. So this is mostly anecdotal. So I think we need to look at some different things, as we mentioned before, to figure out what the cool down can do if we just kind of look at naturally what the workout has done for you as a runner or whoever it is you're training. So again, we have to consider that, what is happening to the body during the session and how to best get back to homeostasis. That's an important thing to look at as quickly as possible. From the energy system, the fatiguing element, and the central nervous system effects. That's what we talked about in the previous slide. I think that if we kind of look at these areas and how to get these back down to baseline, then we can return to normal to come back the next day or whatever it is you're doing, however you set it up, versus looking at, oh, we're reducing injury or something like that. This, I think, is a little bit more key to kind of consider. This also hasn't been studied, but it's sort of one of those things where if you look at what you've done and the body always wants to get back to homeostasis, how can we help it along that process to get ready for the next day? I think it's a better way of looking at this. Okay, so let's, again, just break down what a cool down can do and what a cool down can't do or doesn't do. A cool down can bring the body temperature down slowly and safely. This is important because when your body temperature is way up and it just plummets, it's going to you get more likely that you can get sick or have different infections and things like that because your body's so charged up and then it just plummets. You've already expended a lot of energy. You've probably opened up some small areas in terms of mucus linings and things like that. You have a higher chance of getting sick right after some strenuous activity or a race, and doing this can slowly, more safely reduce body temperature, and it can reduce your chances of getting sick. It can also remove waste products from the training or the race. Okay, this can reduce lingering soreness from the activity. Now, does that mean that you're going to reduce injuries? Well, the study we just looked at said probably not, but you're probably more ready to get going the next day if you get these waste products out, specific waste products that we'll talk about. And return the body to homeostasis, especially the central nervous system. We talked about the body always really wants to be in homeostasis. This is really what it wants to do after activity. This is why your heart rate eventually comes down and after training gets lower, your resting heart rate gets lower because it's getting more used to daily activity because you're giving it that higher intensity. It's getting back to homeostasis. It's trying to give itself something more so that when you give it that intense training, it's not so crazy disrupting all of its systems. So, and really importantly, the central nervous system. That's why I'm kind of cluing that out because that's controlling a lot of what you're doing. Your central nervous system, there's different parts of it that is, resting heart rate, your parasympathetic nervous system versus your sympathetic nervous system. We're not going to get into that a lot, but the idea being that your nervous system is big and what part of it is turned on for you to be in homeostasis and how can we get it back to that. So those are the things that the cool down can do, and we'll look at that specifically in the different types of workouts. And just to, again, highlight this, it cannot really prevent injury going forward. At least there's been no studies that really have bared that out, right? Doesn't mean that it won't come up later on, right? So no studies has found any reduction in injury rate because of any specific cool-down routine. It doesn't mean that's impossible, but nothing has found that to be true yet. So maybe we'll find in the next few years that they have different ways of looking at it, different ways of measuring it, studying injury rates and that kind of thing. But it's important to know that right now, anything that you're doing here is anecdotal, either what you're doing or you've heard somebody else doing in terms of truly injury prevention. Now, if you're keeping track of all these, if you're bringing temperature down slowly, you're less likely to get sick. That's not an injury, but you're going to miss fewer days potentially. You're going to have more quality days if you get rid of the waste products. And again, you're going to be having more quality days if you do this also. So maybe not injury, but more preparation for the next day, for lack of a better term. All right, so this is the same general workout types that we looked at and dissected when we talked about the warm-ups. We have the aerobic workouts, anaerobic workouts, and specifically anaerobic workouts that produce acid. And then we have the strength workouts or the anaerobic workouts that do not produce acid. Just kind of breaking those three down. And again, I'm going to separate these sort of in the same way that we did when we separated the warm-up. So the warm-up specific to the workout, the cool-down should be somewhat specific to the workout also because the work is different. We've got the aerobic workouts. These are at aerobic threshold, which is 65 to 70% VVO2 max. These are your easy runs, for lack of a better term, your long runs and recovery runs. And every one of these workouts on here, I've broken down in specific in videos and description down below, except for some of the anaerobic workouts. We'll do those a little bit later. But if you want to know more about long run, recovery run, and some of the other ones, I have specific videos breaking them down in the description down below. So these are your long and recovery runs, your easy pace. And then I've got a big category here that starts with right here lactic threshold running, and it'll take us through anaerobic workouts that produce acid. So these workouts at lactic threshold, 78 to 92% of VVO2 max. These are your tempo runs and your critical velocity runs. VO2 max runs, so VO2 max tests, VO2 max intervals, and VO2 max repetitions. This is highlighted in yellow because it's also going to come into play in the anaerobic workouts. So these workouts are designed to adapt the aerobic system in various ways, stretching across a wide range of intensities. Remember, we said we want to know what energy system we are stressing. This is part of it, okay? Anaerobic workouts that I also kind of clue in with the same type of cool down. You've got moderate anaerobic glycolytic or anaerobic workouts that produce acid, your extensive and intensive tempo. And you've got intense ones, which are special endurance 1, special endurance 2, and speed endurance. These ones I just have up here, the moderate and the intense. I do not have workout videos on those yet, but I will in the next few weeks. And then VO2 max runs are over here also. The reason being is all of these workouts do accumulate acid, so they stress these workouts are designed to adapt the anaerobic glycolytic system. So VO2 max runs cross over. They are hard stimulus for aerobic, the aerobic system, as well as the anaerobic glycolytic system. So they designed to adapt the anaerobic glycolytic system in various ways by manipulating the body's exposure to certain acid levels. Okay, so different training effect there, but there is some crossover with the VO2 max run. And then strength runs, we've got alactic runs or fly repetitions, as well as static start repetitions using the alactic system. And then hill runs, these are sort of a catch-all. They're going to use the alactic system. They're going to use the aerobic system. They're going to kind of sort of almost tap into the anaerobic glycolytic system, but they're not going to really produce any acid, or that's not true. As we said in a previous video, you're always producing acid. You sitting here watching this produces acid, but we're not going to accumulate acid, is a better way of putting it. So these are hill runs, short hill intervals, medium hill intervals, and long hill intervals are all these types of runs and strength runs. And these workouts are designed to adapt the central nervous system, so that comes up, and then the muscles, we talked about that as a fatiguing element in a previous slide, in various ways to generally enhance force production in different ways. Okay, so those are the general workout types, and we're going to break these down in these 4 categories with what the cooldown could look like and why the cooldown might want to look that way. More importantly, why the cooldown might look that way. I don't care if you take anything from my actual cooldown in this, as long as you're kind of taking the principles and adapting it for you and your situation. That's the most important thing. Alright, aerobic workouts at aerobic threshold. Let's talk about these. These days stress the aerobic system, and pretty much only the aerobic system. As I said, yes, the anaerobic alactic and anaerobic glycolytic system are always working, but they're not really being stressed hard at all on this day, if you're doing it correctly, if you're doing it at the easy pace. If you want to know what the pace for that, again, I would look at those videos in the description down below on recovery runs and long runs. The waste product on these days are water and CO2. Easily removed. So we are not going to have a problem dealing with any of these waste products. You breathe out CO2, your body breathes out a little bit of water, but you're also going to use that for other areas. No issue here. We don't have to deal with waste products being a fatiguing area on this. These days should burn equal amounts of fat and carbohydrate. If done at the right intensity, again, you do it too quickly and you will have an issue with this, but if you don't have the right intensity, there's no specific post-workout snack needed. We don't have to really worry about this. After these days, you just eat a generally good diet that an athletic person might be doing. There's no focus on any one fuel source here. You're burning these two equally, fat and carbohydrate, if done at the right intensity. Fatigue on these days is mostly to the central nervous system. It takes about 12 to 24 hours to recover. So this is what we need to look at recovering on this day. This is because of all the low-intensity foot contacts. If you think about if you're going on a long run, say for 90 minutes when you're in shape in the middle of your general prep phase or whatever, and let's say we've got a kid that typically will go a little bit over 12 miles on those days. That's a lot of foot strikes. A lot of times that your central nervous system is telling all those muscles to fire, 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 fire. At that rate, over and over and over again, if you think that you have, more than 1,000 steps in any mile, there's a variation in there, obviously, based on your stride length, but easily over 1,000 in a mile. That's a lot of times that your body's striking the ground. You're going to fatigue that central nervous system just because of all the nerve, your nerves sending all those different electrical impulses via starting at your central nervous system. This is why you may feel somewhat loopy after a long run or a recovery run. You might be done and you just kind of feel kind of light on your feet. You're like, whoa, I just kind of feel just a little bit loopy. If you train kids on these days, they might act really silly and just really weird after these runs, maybe more weird than normal. This is the reason why, because you fatigue that central nervous system. You brought it down, okay? There's other workouts that increase your central nervous system, kind of bring it up. This is the one that kind of brings it down in the fatiguing process, okay? So I've drawn a line right here underneath to kind of indicate a delineation. We'll come to that in 1 second. But post-workout should focus on returning the central nervous system to homeostasis. In this case, we kind of need to bring it up just a little bit, okay, because we brought it down. What I would recommend to get the central nervous system just charge back up just a tiny bit, okay? This is not something crazy. This is something that a lot of coaches do. It's starting with 4 to 6 strides of 50 to 80 meters. So they're done with their long run or their recovery run, they get a drink or whatever, and you come back and you do these at a similar place, they'll know then the distance isn't super important. It's just enough to kind of open up some of these mechanics and get the central nervous system a little bit more charged up. I would cue medium pace, okay? If you have kids that have been around you for a while, maybe stressed about what a lactic threshold run might feel like, nothing more than that, okay? And tell them to focus on, or yourself, focus on good mechanics. You want good knee drives, arm carriage, upright posture. These things tend to break down on these longer runs. So as you're getting your central nervous system just charged up just a tiny bit, you're opening up just a very, very little bit. You're also working on some mechanical issues to shake off these central nervous system fatigue. Don't let them race this. Do not turn this into a sprinting, let's show off kind of day. Just medium stride, just go and do it as their groups sort of finish up. After you've done your strides, then I would just have some general stretching, and this is to bring the body temperature down slowly. So obviously you've added some body heat, you want to bring it down slowly, and this is going to do this. So the stretching is not to prevent injury or any of those things that you might think you're doing post-race or post-workout stretching. It's really just to kind of keep your body moving, keep your body temperature up just a little bit to more slowly bring it down on these days. Also, if it's a really cold day, you might want to consider, if you've taken some layers off, putting some layers back on. We don't usually have an issue with that here in Tampa, Florida. Only a few days of the year that we really have to deal with that. But if you're in a more cold climate, you might want to do that. I say hold for about 5 to 10 seconds, whatever sort of feels right on this. Again, it's not to prevent anything injury-wise, it's just to kind of keep the body moving. The first two that we do, and I'll show you what these look like, these are not at all earth-shattering at all. You might have a great routine too. Again, it's not super important what you're doing as long as you're kind of keeping this idea in mind. The first ones are standing up, and then the next one underneath the line are sitting down. So just some basic arm stretching, whatever you do, crossover, arm behind your head, that kind of thing. And then your feet together, straight down, and then take your right leg and go over your left and do the same thing, straight down, left over right, straight down. These are all hamstring stretches. Actually, this is in the wrong place. It should be right here. That's kind of funny. These ones are also done standing up. So feet apart, same thing. Your feet are apart and you're going straight down, and then you're grabbing your right ankle and then you're grabbing your left ankle. It's sort of hamstring and hips and all those different muscles in your upper part of your leg that you're kind of getting here. Then you should be on the ground for butterfly. Most of you would know what that is. And you've got, we just call it right over lefts. You're kind of almost like sitting on the ground without actually sitting. And then we kind of roll over. These are all to stretch your hip. And then we're going to flip over and do it the other way. What we call figure fours. I'll show you what that looks like. That may not make sense, but you do these with each leg. Right leg lunge, that should make sense. And then something we call paraformas. I don't know if it's actually called that anywhere other than this. We had a kid that called this. That was in our program a couple of years ago, so it just kind of stuck. And then we did the left leg and then some basic calf stretches. So I'll show you what these look like right now. So I'll just kind of go through them. I'll stop on the ones that are probably less commonly known. These ones should be very simple. Just, again, feet together, straight down. Just stretch those hamstrings out a little bit. Again, it's not really super critical there is no injury prevention going on here. It's really just about keeping the body moving a little bit. And then our right over left, same kind of thing, straight down. Not holding it for a super long amount of time, just a little bit, 5 to 10 seconds, just keep yourself moving. And switch. Again, nothing too earth-shattering here. And go feet apart, straight down. Sorry that part of this was cut off. And just grab your right ankle, grab your left ankle. I think I decided I didn't do it for quite long enough, so I kind of went back. Then we're going to do the ones that are on the ground. Again, I believe everybody knows what butterfly looks like at this point. You're going to bring your feet all the way in as the neighbor goes by. I'm sort of pushing down on my legs with my elbow. These are the ones that are a little bit probably less common, and you may want to add these, maybe not. You've probably got a good stretching routine anyway. You're basically just going to take your right leg and go over your left. It's kind of like you're sitting cross-legged, and then you're going to have your butt be as low to the ground as possible without actually sitting on the ground. You will feel it in this crossover leg, all this area stretching out, that whole IT band and this part of your hip, as you just kind of sit down. And as you are in that position, you're going to just, after this, take that foot that's already over there, and roll over. Take that opposite arm and just continue to stretch out that same hip just a little bit. And again, this is for heat loss reasons, just to slowly bring it down. So again, the nature of this isn't super critical as long as you're doing things that just sort of feel right for you. I'm doing the other leg now, left over right, holding it for a little bit. This is one of my more favorite ones just for me. My hips tend to be a little bit more tight. And then do the roll over too. This next one are the figure fours. Kind of similar to what you just did. You're going to be almost like you're cross-legged, but you're going to be lying down. In this case, with your right leg over, you're then going to take your left hand, and you're going to take your right hand first, in between, and your left hand around the outside, and pull back. Looks like a 4 kind of. And then just switch to the other side. Again, right or left hand between, right hand pull back, and it just sort of looks like a 4. These are just the things that the group that I work with right now likes. Again, we change this kind of like when we change our warm up. Again, we'll do some lunges here. This is going to be left leg forward. What I'm pointing to here is my knee is going to be right over my toe. You're going to feel it in this back hip. You'll notice that this is not like me just standing straight. I'm going to be upright in my posture, but this leg is further back, so you can get a good stretch in this leg that's back. So it's actually the right side that's being stretched here as I'm indicating. So that's the lunge, and then the piriformas. Got ahead of myself there. You're almost sort of like making a 4 again. You're taking that leg that was in front and crossing it over. And now you're getting both hips at the same time here. To the other side. Left leg now, right knee right over your toe. And again, do the piriforma. Try to keep that leg that's in front perpendicular to your back leg, so it would form a good 90-degree right angle. And then this is just calf stretches. I did a horrible job here of showing you, but this is basically where you're just pushing back on your calves. You're taking one and putting your one leg over the top of the other one. I think I switched to a different, I switched to a different position for the other side and just stretch out that calf just a little bit. All right, so you can't see it, but that video was 4.5 minutes, so you're just keeping your body temperature elevated for just that little bit of time so that you're reducing the chance of getting sick after something, some type of workout. So there's certainly nothing earth-shattering about a stride here, but in case you wanted to know what it could look like here. This will just be me coming through with one of my post-workout strides. Again, it's not super fast, but it's not meant to be as you are doing it. Just something to, again, get that central nervous system a little bit more back to baseline. And if you wanted to kind of look at where my focus is, this is me at half speed, just really trying to think about good knee drive, arm swings, good mechanics as I come through on the stride. Show it one more time. I'm really trying to think about, you know, getting that knee up, making sure that I'm mid-foot striking, making sure I've got good arm carriage as I come through with this stride. Just really kind of good mechanics as best you can, and get that central nervous system woken back up. Alright, let's go ahead and step things up a little bit to a slightly higher intensity type workouts. We're looking at tempo, VO2 max, and anaerobic workouts, the ones that produce acid. So my cooldown routine is a fairly similar pattern with all of these, with the difference being sometimes on the more intense days you might have to step things up if you're developing more acid. That would be on the right of your screen, the anaerobic workouts. Tempo workouts are not going to be accumulating any acid, but you still might want to do some of these things as you go into it for some of these different purposes. So kind of play this as you see fit. I'll tell you what we do, and you can kind of take from this what you think makes the most sense for your situation. So these days, stress the aerobic system with different levels of contributions from the anaerobic system, and we're talking about the anaerobic glycolytic system, right? In previous videos, we talked about tempo runs. The acid's not accumulating, but at tempo pace, or lactic threshold is more scientific way of putting it, you are getting an actual significant contribution from the anaerobic glycolytic system. So that's stressing it somewhat, but the focus is aerobic. Then we've got middle here. These workouts you are going to stop because the acid will be accumulating. When you run a 2 mile, the reason you have to stop if you're relatively in shape. Some people can't go the distance, but if you're an in shape distance runner, the reason you have to stop a 2 mile test, which is one of the best VO2 max tests you can have, is the accumulation of acid. So this is stressing you aerobically. It's the fastest aerobic pace, and there's an increased demand from the anaerobic glycolytic system, so different level there. And then here, it's reducing the aerobic stresses, but it's increasing the anaerobic stresses, because anything faster than VO2 max, which is what these anaerobic paces are, the increased pace is not coming from the aerobic system. It has to come from the anaerobic glycolytic system. So different levels here, but there are some commonalities that I think mean that you would want to treat some of these things somewhat differently, maybe just stressing different aspects of your cooldown or post-workout activities. So the anaerobic system we're talking about here is going to add lactic acid as a waste product. And we talked about this in the previous videos. It's actually, lactic acid lasts for about a quarter second, and then it splits. The lactate goes to the liver, and it's actually reused and turned into more stored glucose or glycogen. It's that acid that is sitting off that reduces the pH, that little acid ion that I've shown you in previous videos. It's in the description down below for alactic as well as tempo workouts. That's what causes the issue, that free hydrogen ion. Okay, so we're going to have to potentially deal with that. And the aerobic system leaves only CO2 and water as easily to deal with waste products. So that's not the issue, it's this first part. We have this waste product that's it's less easy to deal with, this lactic acid. So we're going to have to address this. All right, so these days are going to be burning mostly carbohydrates due to the higher intensity that we were talking about. These step up the intensity at various levels, but they're all going to be burning a lot of carbohydrates. And these could benefit from a post-workout snack or drink to replace this, and I'll talk about what kind of makes the most sense from some different research that's been done. So that is something we do need to address, post-workout refueling, because fuel stores is going to be one of the things that's an issue on this day. Okay, so the fatigue on these days comes from the fuel source and acidosis, because the fuel's being used a lot, it's a higher intensity, and then, as I said, there's different contributions from the anaerobic alactic system. Acidosis is just a fancy way of saying your body's pH is dropping or it's becoming more acidic. These two things, fuel stores and acidosis, takes 24 to 48 hours recovery, so about twice as long as the central nervous system fatigue that we were talking about in aerobic threshold running, okay? So just kind of break these down from the different ones because there's similarities, but it's kind of like different levels of these things that are happening. Tempo runs generally burn the most stored carbohydrates because it's the highest volume at an intensity that's higher than aerobic threshold. It burns carbohydrates, tempo workouts like no tomorrow. It's one of the reasons why I mentioned in the video on tempo runs in the description down below, or lactic threshold runs, that this is where a lot of times coaches go incorrect in how often they do it. Because if you just burn your glycogen, your stored carbohydrate, day after day after day, it becomes harder and harder to store more of it. And it's why sometimes you'll see people that are running great midway through the season just completely die out because they're doing too much of this. And it's why a lot of coaches think that tempo runs are some kind of magic bullet. It's because it looks short-term like it helps, but long-term, you just destroy your body's ability to restore this. So we want to definitely work on stored carbohydrates on these days. VO2 max also burns a lot of carbohydrates, not quite as much usually because the volume is lower, and it's going to have moderate acidosis. And the anaerobic glycolytic or acid-producing accumulating system, it's going to burn some carbohydrates because it's really fast, but it's lower volume, so it's not going to be as much as the other two, but has much higher acidosis. So again, this is the idea of you want to kind of adjust accordingly with what I'm going to kind of talk about here, recommend how you want to be able to deal with these three things based on what you're doing, but there are definite similarities, just sort of like a sliding scale of, all right, tempo runs, I don't have to worry about so much of the acidosis, maybe a little bit, but I definitely need to worry about the carbohydrate stores. The anaerobic ones, I definitely need to worry about the acidosis, not quite as much about the stored glucose, and then VO2 max is kind of somewhere more in the middle. So kind of put this together as you see fit. So post-workout, I recommend focusing on clearing acid. Obviously, again, with the anaerobic, that's the most important. A little less important with VO2 max, less important in tempo. Okay, safely bringing that body temperature down. Okay, and returning to homeostasis. So a lot of the things are similar here. So this is what I would say. For all three of these, I recommend starting with a longer cooldown. Okay. Different based on what you're doing. In the video I had on tempo workouts, I say I recommend adding 2 miles on the back end, but that's really more to make sure the volume doesn't slip on those days because tempo workouts can be low in volume if you don't do something like that. That's really not so much to clear the acid on those days, but it's also to slowly bring the body temperature down. So on tempo runs, typically we add about 20 minutes or 2 miles or so on the back end and bring the heart rate down for the homeostasis, kind of bringing that back to level. You want 20 plus minutes. We've talked about central VO2 max development. 20 continuous minutes at aerobic intensities is the only way you're really going to get any central VO2 max development on any of these days once you're in shape. So keep that rule of thumb. If you want to add on something to these, make sure the 20 plus minutes. I would say, and this is probably more for the other two, for the VO2 max and the anaerobic days, 3 to 4, usually 3 on VO2 max, usually 4 on the anaerobic acid producing days. That's a factor of the volume that's going on in that, but also the nature of you need more of it to clear on those high anaerobic days to get that acid out. And the reason why I'm saying clear it, what that's going to do is, and we talk about this in detail in some of the videos in the description down below, your anaerobic glycolytic system produces those hydrogen ions, which the mitochondria use for aerobic respiration. So the idea being is having that cool down does clear this from it. So if you've got a day that you're doing some really higher intensity anaerobic work, longer is what I recommend for us. We do about 3 to 4 VO2 max, usually 3, sometimes 4 on like a VO2 max test, a little bit less volume, but that's more of a volume thing for the day, not to clear the acid. You do this and you're going to clear that acid out. It's why I don't necessarily recommend doing ice baths, but it's kind of the same thing. But if you do this, it's the same sort of effect as an ice bath, but you also get the aerobic development too. So you're killing 2 birds with 1 stone as opposed to just clearing the acid with the ice, and then you're not getting any aerobic development too. You can do both, but this gives that two-pronged attack, getting rid of it naturally. Well, not naturally. Icing's not an unnatural way, but in the way that your body intends to metabolize this waste product and also get some nice aerobic benefits too. After you do that cool down, it's recommended, especially on the tempo day where it's a little bit less intense, just sort of jump right into your cool down. If you need 30 seconds to kind of form up with somebody so you're cooling down with somebody, but jump right into it on those days. VO2 max, and on these days especially, we might use spikes or something. There's probably going to be a lag time to where it's not going to be continuous, but it's going to recommend being a little longer anyway. So you're going to go into your cool down and then have your general stretching, and I would be this general stretching exactly like what I was showing you previously for the aerobic threshold days. Okay, bring that body temp down just slowly, same as before. I forgot to say on these days as you're doing it, you don't have to go truly at aerobic threshold. Let's say you've got somebody who's like, the example I've used in previous videos is a boy going 10:30. Their aerobic threshold's about 7:40 to about a little bit over 8-minute pace. On these days, do it based on heart rate or more on feel. As long as their heart rate's over about 120, it's fine. It's going to be slower after one of these days, simply by the nature of they're doing more and their body's more fatigued. So don't worry so much about truly aerobic threshold pacing. Just worry about feel, and as long as they're over 120 on their heart rate as they're going through it, you're perfectly fine on this cooldown. It does not have to be at aerobic threshold. Jump into your general stretching. And then this is, I'll show you this video here. We always on tempo days, VO2 max days, and anaerobic days. No matter what we're doing, if we're at one of those intensities, we add, after all this, so the third thing, an additional relaxation technique. It's just 5 to 10 minutes. We find a place where we can prop our legs up on a fence. I like doing it when we're at a park where we can do it on a bench. You just kind of rest your calves on the bench, and you're using no muscle energy at all. Close your eyes, 5 to 10 minutes, and you're just relaxing. You're just trying to bring that heart rate down, bring your body, into the more resting state of homeostasis, bring the heart rate down, and it's just a really, the kids really tend to like this, actually. They'll ask me, if we're doing it, because they definitely do like adding this on the back end. It just kind of brings them and resets them, so... This is generally what it looks like. This was after a VO2 max test day from a video I'm just stealing this from. You can see they just got their legs propped up. They have their eyes closed because it was a sunny day. Some of them were covering their face or whatever, but are putting their heads in their shirt. But it's just a very relaxing. Try and use no muscle energy. Just keep your legs propped up. Just very, very simple. Nothing too much to this. You just want to keep everything sort of nice and relax and try and bring them back down to as normal as possible. So that's one thing that you could do as a stretching or as a relaxation technique, as a third way of bringing them back down to baseline. This really focuses on the homeostasis resetting that we talked about. So you've got your run, you've got your run to address what we talked about, the acid clearing. You've got the stretch and also the slow reduction of body temperature. You've got the stretching to, again, slowly reduce body temperature and return to homeostasis. And then right here, you're going to bring them back down to homeostasis. So these are the three things that we said we have to address. And if you do these three things, you can definitely address them. It does take a minute to get all this through. If you're doing 4 miles, probably 35 minutes, about 5 minutes of stretching on this. So probably about 45 minutes to make it all happen. But it really does make a difference on getting you ready for the next day. Alright, so the one thing that we didn't address is that idea of it's good to have something to kind of get into your system right afterwards to address the fuel source issue that can be an issue on these days. You're using a lot of carbohydrates. We've addressed the waste product. We've addressed the homeostasis fatigue, but we didn't address the fuel system or the fuel stores that are being used. So this is what I want to chat about in this slide. So this is the additional point about this post-workout drink and snack. The body is best able to restore carbohydrates, which again, this can be an issue if you're doing a lot of intense stuff. You want to make sure that you recharge this, and if you do a lot of this without recharging it, it can be more difficult for a human to restore this if you're constantly keeping the store of stored glucose at 0. So if you take this, it's best restored if you take carbs soon after completing the exercise, say 30 minutes to about 2 hours. So it's a kind of a big window, but not... You can't just sit around doing nothing all day, right? You definitely want to then go into a fasting period or something like that to restore this. So having something ready to go, it makes a decent amount of sense. So I would kind of do two-pronged attack for kind of like the maximum benefit. I would start with a drink wherever you're training, having something to quickly get into your system, followed by a full meal when you get home. So you've got a drink. Quickly, your body's going to quickly use the drink to refuel, and then you can use the solid food to further fuel the storage. So 30 minutes afterwards, obviously the drink, if you got it right there on site, boom, you got that, and then get something in your system within 2 hours. You're going to best recharge the stored fuel that you've used on these days. So, but what is the best post-workout drink? There's obviously a lot of different things that you can look at. So, one really interesting study, and this is something that we definitely do. I do this a lot on your VO2 max days because it's sort of a combination of you're doing some muscle trauma, obviously, because it's a somewhat higher intensity, higher volume, but you're also burning a lot of carbohydrate. And so, this is what I do on our VO2 max days. I don't do this every day. I do it on our VO2 max intervals in our tests. This study was done in 2012, or was published in 2012, and it's called Chocolate Milk and Endurance Exercise Recovery, Protein Balance, Glycogen, and Performance. That's kind of interesting, chocolate milk. Okay, so go and look for yourself if you don't believe me on this, but if you want to take my word for it, this study suggests that, and it doesn't suggest, they found, that chocolate milk or strawberry flavored milk, or basically something that has that extra flavoring, the extra sugar in it, it increased the rate of carbohydrate and protein absorption by the body. For some reason, it was this ratio, this 4-to-1 ratio, 4 carbs to 1 protein. For some reason, that ratio allowed your body to better absorb both the carbohydrates and the protein. For some reason. Don't know why. When they looked at it with plain milk, which is a 3-to-1 ratio, it did not have nearly as good of an absorption rate as if you added that extra sweet treat to it. Chocolate milk, strawberry milk, whatever. I'm sure there's other flavors there, but chocolate milk was really what they studied. But if you look at it, a lot of the strawberry flavored milks that are on the market have the similar carbohydrate ratio, so I usually have both ready, whichever one the kid wants, and they kind of get it right into their system. After they've done their cool down, get it right into their system. They've done their 3-mile cool down, 30 minutes. As they're doing their stretching, go ahead and get this into your system. So in this case, chocolate milk is definitely better than just plain milk on these days if you're looking for it. Sports drinks are really great too. Sports drinks, it didn't have this rate of absorption. There's no protein in sports drinks. It's just your water, your glucose, and your flavorings and your electrolytes. So there's no protein, but you still offer benefits. You have a large amount of carbohydrates that are used. So I do this. You can do this on any of these days too. I will try and do this when I can on tempo runs or potentially anaerobic workouts when I know it's going to be like a really hot day. So it's kind of a 2-for-1 with the electrolytes as well as the carbohydrates being used. I actually did a video on recharging after a hotter day and what it kind of takes and breaking down the electrolytes. I'll put it in the description down below to kind of look at it. So kind of like pick and choose. Like I said, for me, VO2 max days is when I break out the chocolate milk for them. On tempo or anaerobic glycolytic days, those are the days that I usually stick more to sports drinks. The sports drinks are easier because you don't have to keep them. I mean, obviously you want to keep them cold just for the taste, but you have to kind of more control the temperature of milk. Otherwise, you're going to have a bunch of kids getting sick on you. So that's something to kind of keep in mind that you might want to add to kind of keep it right there for them. Or you could just encourage them to do this too if you wanted to. A lot of times when we'll be doing maybe like a workout that we're kind of off campus, the kids will all go to the same gas station and all get chocolate milk or something like that afterwards. So that's something you can also add to address the fuel stores. But get something in your system about 30 minutes after. A drink is great because it's more easily used. And then a snack or a full meal within 2 hours after completion. Let's take a look at these. I'm going to do strength workouts first because it's most similar to what we were just checking out, so nothing really is going to change here in terms of what I'm going to recommend, but the reason for it is different, so you might have a different idea. So this is going to stress the alactic system and strength capacity. Doing that hill work, that resistance is going to really work on their muscles and their strength capacity. And it's going to be different contributions of the aerobic system, basically on the cool down and the recovery in between. I did a whole video on short hill intervals that I would recommend taking a look at. The alactic system creates no waste products, and the aerobic system is just going to be the CO2 in the water. So this isn't something we're really going to worry about too much. The muscles, they are going to produce acid, but it's not going to accumulate. Okay, so as we said, it's every time you're using your muscles, you just sitting here watching this, you're making acid, but it's not going to accumulate. So this is not something we're really going to worry about on this day, really overtaxing the energy systems. These days use creatine phosphate. Okay, that's the alactic system. And then these are a little bit longer. There's a little bit of a lag where the creatine phosphate shuts down, but short hill intervals at least are not going to use a ton of anything else, but then it's going to be equal parts carbohydrates to fat on the cool down and the recovery part. So for the creatine phosphate, this would benefit from a post-workout addition of some kind of protein. It doesn't really matter. Maybe it's like, almonds or something like that. You could also throw the chocolate milk here on this. The extra protein is one for the creatine phosphate. That actually only comes from animal protein. I'll talk about that a little bit more in the next workout type. But you're also putting that extra stress, the strength capacity on the muscles that I was mentioning up here. The protein is more to kind of repair them that we're going to talk about here in this next point, which is where the fatigue is coming from. Fatigue is the fuel stores and the central nervous system. The fuel stores is the creatine phosphate. That is recharged very quickly. Creatine phosphate is actually recharged in 80% of it is recharged in 3 minutes, and it's like 98% back after 10 minutes. And then the central nervous system is going to be, back to baseline in 12 to 24 hours. So that's not a problem. But there can be additional muscle fatigue and secondary fatigue from small micro traumas to the muscles and the tendons. So those are all kind of connected. Tendons move muscles and everything, so this is all connecting. So the idea that we're really stressing the strength capacity of these muscles is really where the issue could potentially be on these days. So as I mentioned, alactic system is fueled by creatine phosphate, resynthesized in 3 to 10 minutes, no problem there. Training central nervous system to send signals fast for rapid force production, so that's fatiguing there. The extent and resistance from the hill does put additional demands on the working muscles, so we may have an additional, and there's some studies that say this, sometimes we find it. I find that on these days, because I recommend doing these often, that this last point doesn't happen. There is the idea that whenever you do something plyometrically, that there's additional fatigue that happens 3 to 7 days after, because that's when your body really starts to fix these micro traumas. So we kind of have to put a question mark here of what we really need to focus on. For me, if you're doing these hill runs regularly, not once a month, or, oh, I've got a meet coming in a week and it's got a hill, so I'm going to throw hills. That's not... Then I wouldn't even do hill workouts if you're just going to throw them in there randomly. If you do these regularly, that last point really isn't there. The creatine phosphate is resynthesized, so no big deal. You can obviously give it some more protein in the post-workout, and then the central nervous system is brought back to normal in 12 to 24 hours. It's really this last part that we want to look at, too, that could be an issue, the potential fatigue that can happen in those muscles. So what I recommend, though, even though it's different things that we're fatiguing here, I think this really fits very similarly to the last group that we looked at, but for different reasons here. We're looking at the muscle stress. We're still bringing down homeostasis and the body temperature, but the muscle fatiguing could benefit from some of the other things that we've been talking about here. So some things that I recommend, and some of these are for the cool down purposes and some of them are not, and I'll kind of point those out here. Post-workout, really focus on volume. This is not necessarily for a cool down reason, but these days volume can be low. So my focus is really making sure that I've added something on the back end to increase the overall volume. You're really focusing from a cool down or post-workout, reducing body temperature and the return to homeostasis. So this is why you have the longer cooldowns on these days. I recommend about 3 miles to get these workouts, between 7-8 miles, something like that. This brings the body temperature down and for aerobic development, okay? Not clearing acid. You're not accumulating acid on these days. First is the alactic system using it. You're going to blend a little bit in the anaerobic glycolytic system, but because you've got the recovery in between and these being, not super long depending on how you're doing them, this is not clearing for acid. This is for volume development. Keep the principles in mind, 20 plus minutes that we talked about. 3 to 4 miles is typically what we do. Then after that, just like before, you do your general stretching for the same reason in this case, to bring the body temperature down, okay? And there's not necessarily a need for additional relaxation to help the central nervous system return to normal, but the muscles might benefit from this, because what you do, that same propping of the legs up can help blood from not pooling at your extremities, at your legs, right? So it can help return to homeostasis. So this isn't for the reason that we were talking about it before, but it can help with reducing pooling in your legs. And I'll tell you, my group just kind of likes doing it on these days too, so I let them kind of do it. So this is basically the same thing as the last slide, but the reason I separated it here is there's different reasons you're doing it. So for you, you might see some of these things and say, I want to add this or I want to take this out because it's for a different reason here. It may not be something that you kind of think makes sense. This is what has worked for us. And the last one, the alactic runs. These days stress the anaerobic alactic system also, with different contributions from the aerobic system, again, on the cool down and the recovery. Less in terms of that muscle, those more big-time muscle issues in terms of fatigue the moment of, okay? So this is what kind of makes this different from those hill runs. Alactic system creates almost no waste product that we all talked about, and then the CO2 and water from the aerobic system. So again, we don't have to worry about any of those things in this. On these days, we use creatine phosphate for the alactic part of it. This would benefit from a workout addition, and there's the different part of protein that is animal-based. So on the other one, I want to give them some protein to help the muscles that have broken down. On this day, I'm doing this more because of the fuel source. Creatine phosphate, and you have some people that maybe they don't eat meat. That's perfectly fine. This would simply be a recommendation. Creatine phosphate is only found in animal muscle tissue. The reason being, this is the fastest way your body resynthesizes, ATP. It is for fast movement. Muscles are what move fast. Plants don't move very much, so they are not going to have creatine phosphate in them at all. So if you're trying to give them a post-workout snack specifically to recharge the fuel source that is being used on this day, you're probably not going to have hamburgers or something like that with them, but you might recommend to them, hey guys, on the alactic days, if your parents can, or if you're going to get something afterwards, you know, you might want to have a little more animal protein than you normally would, just to take care of the fact that you did use a lot of creatine phosphate on this one. That would be the only thing. So probably not a post-workout snack in this case, so I changed that, but would benefit from something in that animal protein base. If they don't eat meat, it's perfectly fine. It's not going to horribly kill them, but if you wanted to address this in that respect, that would be one way that you could do it to recommend on this day. So being a little more specific on the source of the protein. Fatigue on these days. Oh, and if you're interested in fuel source, I did a video on it a few months ago. I'll put it in the description down below too, if you're interested in fuel sources and that kind of thing. Alright, so fatigue on these days is the fuel source. We talked about that. Central nervous system, alright, 12 to 24 hours. Nothing too crazy here. We've talked about that. With the secondary fatigue from small muscle traumas to muscle and tendons. Again, I've not really seen this because I do this workout, even in general prep, at the very least 3 times a month. So every other week is the furthest we get away from it. Sometimes a little more, sometimes a little bit less, depending on what we're doing with hill workouts and other things we're doing. I don't see this happen, but this is definitely reported from anything that's plyometrically based, and this is. So this is that same point that I had on the other slide, but I took out the point about the extra muscle trauma, because this is really only 30 meters is what I recommend for distance runners. You can do it different ways, and videos in the description down below where I talk about this. I took that other point out because 30 meters, that's not really going to be a big muscle fatigue. What's going to fatigue is the store of creatine phosphate. So, alactic system is fueled by creatine phosphate, which is resynthesized in 3 to 10 minutes. Training the central nervous system is to send these signals fast for rapid force production, so that's why that fatigues. You are rapidly getting your body to coordinate and synchronize the muscle, so it's fast sending of those signals from the central nervous system. And as I said, may have that additional fatigue 3 to 7 days after from muscle or tendon traumas. Again, once you've done this, first time you do it, yeah, they might be sore from it, maybe the second time, but if you're doing this regularly, I don't find this actually happens in any great degree, if any degree at all. But it could be there, so I don't really worry about all these things. These are all things that are pretty easy to deal with, especially if you're doing this regularly. Okay, so post-workout. You're going to have some of the things, but I would definitely recommend cutting out something that we recommended earlier. So post-workout, I would focus on not allowing the volume to slip. So for the same reason, this is not to reduce anything except body temperature. This is our longest cool-down day because the volume can be sort of low on these days, while slowly reducing body temperature. That's really all we're doing, okay? Longer cooldown on these days to bring body temperature down, and for aerobic development, not clearing acid. You're not going to be accumulating acid on these days. Principle still applies, 20 plus minutes. Usually we do 4 miles on these days. This is a high volume day when you have everything all added up. It's about 8 to 9 miles. If you do 8 to 10 fly 30s is how I recommend doing this. But there's not a lot of truly aerobic development happening in the actual bit, so that's why I go longer on the cooldown on this. But again, it is not to clear acid. Slowly reduce the body temperature. Obviously, you could do that in 10 minutes, but I want to get the extra development. If I'm going to do 10 minutes, I might as well get some extra benefit out of it. Then just have your general stretching like I talked about before, body temperature coming down, same as before. But here's the one thing that's a little different. On these days, you kind of want the central nervous system charged up, right? In fact, this is a day where later on you might want to do some lifting. I would actually recommend, and this is the only day besides, it's sort of like the opposite extremes. Aerobic threshold day, we do not do the relaxation techniques. Alactic day, we do not do those 5 to 10 minutes of relaxation techniques. So I kind of want them to stay a little bit more charged up. I want the central nervous system a little bit more up-tempo, just because, again, this is something that distance runners are not necessarily great at typically. So I kind of want that increase in central nervous system if I can get it to keep along. So there's really no extra need for those additional relaxation techniques on these days. You can leave it in if you want. The kids always ask me for it on this day, and I say I would recommend not doing it. You can if you want to, but it would be best to, after you're stretching, head on out, go home, get a meal in you, maybe get a meal that's got some animal protein in it as quickly as you can, and get your schoolwork done and get ready for the next day. Alright, so some key points here. This will be the last slide. There's no perfect cooldown. I hope I made that really clear. I hope I gave you some ideas of what you could do, focusing on getting the body recovered based on the workout type, and you can use that to best work for your situation. I gave you some suggestions of what we do. certainly not the perfect one in the world. There might be some people cringing at what we're doing. It's what works for us in our situation. It might be totally different for you. Think about getting your body recovered for the next day based on what you just did. A cool down can bring your body temperature down slowly, okay, prevent you from, or reduce the chances of you getting sick. It can clear those waste products, the acid if you've developed it, if you've done a day that has acid accumulation, and return your body to homeostasis, okay? Those are the things the cool down or post-workout activities can do. They cannot reduce injury rate, or at least we've not found a study that says that is the case yet, okay? So maybe they do, and we haven't discovered it yet, but no real well-looked at study has said that is the case yet. Maybe we'll find that in the next few years. Maybe we won't. That's what the science, that's what the research says right now. There are some things that you can do on the so this day. You can benefit from a post-workout snack or drink depending on the fuel source that are being used. So plan accordingly so you can refuel quickly. Some days it might be a drink of some type, chocolate milk or a sports drink that you prefer, and then a meal as when you get home. Maybe it's something that's to refuel on the protein side, maybe some almonds or something like that on the hill days, and maybe just making sure that you've got an animal-based protein meal waiting for you when you get home on the alactic day. So just kind of plan that accordingly if you can, if you've got a really good idea of what's happening when. Maybe if you're training yourself, obviously you can plan this out. Or if you're a coach, I would recommend having that at least a week out, your kids knowing kind of what they're doing on what days. I like having months out. I post everything that I have for the whole season that I have planned, which I can obviously change as need be. I like doing that just so they can plan around things if they need to for jobs and doctor's appointments and things like that. But they can also kind of know, they can tell their parents, hey, we've got a tempo run in 2 days. Can we have, pasta that day or something like that, just to kind of like has it. So plan accordingly if you can. And then last point, I'm not going to talk about this a lot in this video, just kind of mentioning at the end, you can do some strength-based activities afterwards based on what you have in certain days. I'll do a whole video where I talk about different strength-based things that you can do and what kind of pairs nicely, but kind of just think about it, keep it in mind. If you've got a lot of acid development, you're probably not going to get a lot out of strength work those days. If you have the central nervous system charged up from an alactic day, you might want to do some things. And then on more general days, you might want to do more core. And I like actually calling it trunk work, focusing on that hip and controlling your trunk. I think there's a lot of focus on core muscles, those abdominals, and those are good for breathing and things like that, but a lot of core work in terms of your abdominals also puts you in more of a slouched over position, which is bad for running. I like to think more trunk work when I'm doing this, but you might want to have some lifting or some plyometric work, etc., that kind of thing. So I'll talk about that in a video in the next couple days or week or so, but there are some things that you can add to it in terms of strength development, but for this, I really wanted to focus more on bringing yourself back down to baseline if you're in that situation. So if you like this video, please think about liking or subscribing. If you have any questions, please ask them in the comments down below. I've had some great questions recently that maybe I didn't explain something correctly, or you just have something for your situation. Let me know. I'd love to answer those. If you haven't known, I'm kind of wordy when I do this stuff in both speaking and in my written responses in some of the videos down below. So I would encourage that if you have any questions, I'd love to answer them. If you found this helpful, maybe think about sharing it around with some other people who are running enthusiasts also. And again, hit that subscribe button if you haven't done so already. I usually post about 3 to 5 videos a week on different aspects of running, training, workout design. Sometimes I just throw some athlete profiles and things like that in there too that you might find interesting. So if you do find this interesting, hit the subscribe button. It would really help me out, and I would really appreciate it. In the next couple days, like I said, I'll look at doing some different things, looking at a video maybe on some different strength development that you can do with runners, either yourself or somebody else. I'm going to look at maybe some mileage in your general preparation, kind of going back to that cross-country macrocycle video series I was doing. And then I was thinking of doing something on some where your off days should kind of be, how many off days and things like that. So look forward to those videos in the next days and weeks. And until next time, this has been Coachy TV.